the title of this paper is a working paper. It's called Ndibile, Unpacking the Narratives of Breathing Dust Underground. Please excuse my pronunciation. I'm not a mother tongue Xhosa speaker. And if any of you are wondering what the pink stuff you're looking at on the screen, it is TB, what it looks like underneath a microscope. And I'm hoping it'll make sense as I move through my presentation. There we go. Sorry, let's just see. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to be drawing, my presentation is based on my master's and my honors research, and it's based at trying to understand how miners make sense of TB, what their perceptions are. So I'll try to provide a multi-dimensional analysis as to how they interpret and understand and experience TB. And in doing so, it provides commentary on what the lived experience is like to breathe underground, what it's like actually for the miners underground. The miners' narratives illustrate how miners understand TB in terms of the geographical and political contexts, and these are crucial factors to understand the high rate of TB in the mines, and also to highlight the forces that make them more vulnerable or susceptible to TB. And these narratives are often overlooked in understanding epidemiology, TB epidemiology. So the research was based again from my honors research, which I did in 2014 in West Rand with gold miners, and then with platinum miners in Rustenburg, and I primarily only dealt with females in the platinum industry. And so the research methods that I used was participant observation, life histories, in-depth interviews, focus groups, and mine visits. The miners had busy schedules and they spend most of their time on the mine, so most of the research was done there. But outside of their working hours, the research participants allowed me to enter their lives, doing chores with them, grocery shopping, accompanying them to the clinic, to visit friends and family. Yes. So for several decades, occupational diseases such as TB and silicosis have plagued South Africa's mining industry. The high prevalence of TB among miners coincides with the early gold rush in 1886. It is estimated that nearly 50,000 miners died between 1886 and 1912 from TB. And other occupational lung-related diseases. You have scholars, renowned scholars such as Randall Packard, who in 1989 was quoted saying that that it was generally agreed upon that the mining industry has played a major contribution to the development of TB among miners in South Africa, and the miners then also circulated back home to their families. Packard's description of TB in the late 1980s still remains true post 20 years into post-apartheid. South African miners have the highest rates of TB in the world. The TB infection rate among miners is estimated to be 3,000 to 7,000 per 100,000. This is 4 to 7 times higher than that of the general population in South Africa. The mining sector is considered to be an institutional amplifier of TB because the mine sites produce a significantly higher than average TB infection rate. This could be attributed to the mining environment is often damp, overcrowded, enclosed, and has poor ventilation. These factors create an ideal setting for maximizing the transmission of the disease. In addition to that, the limited amount of sunlight in the working underground allows for the bacteria to thrive and to pass between co-workers. So to start conversations around TB with the miners, I had a survey document survey, and it consisted of three main questions. What do you think is TB? What do you think causes TB? And what are the symptoms of TB? Now, according to biomedical research, TB is an infectious disease that is caused by the TB bacteria. It is spread via droplets in fluid in the air. It is so somebody who is infected with TB, if they cough or they sneeze, they can propel the infected air droplets into somebody else, just like corona, in a sense. And so what's interesting is that none of my research participants acknowledged TB as being caused, as a first response being caused by a bacterial infection. They all stressed the importance of understanding TB more in terms of conditions underground, particularly in relation to breathing in dust. And this was apparent in both the gold mining and the platinum industry. So regardless of what mineral was being mined, this was a common idea that was shared. I think it's important to stress that I'm not suggesting that the miners hold an inaccurate view of TB transmission, or to argue that education is required. I look at dust as more as an organizing metaphor. And it's also important to note that their perceptions have not interfered with the miners keeping up their treatment regimes. Yes. So I am going to draw on draw on three miners' narratives to kind of illustrate this picture. So I'm going to draw on what Amo had to say. Amo is a safety worker at Impala Platinum. So she makes sure that everybody complies with wearing their mask or whatever safety procedures are adhered to underground. She's been working at Impala Platinum for 15 years and she's contracted TB at some point working on the mines. And this is what she had to say. She was like, I can't with 100% accuracy say what causes TB. I think majorating, picret cement or drilling dust, but also the fumes and the chemicals. Those chemicals are so strong, they sit in your chest and make you suffocate. I don't know if I can explain it properly, but you'll understand when you go underground. And surely the day when I did go underground, I understood what she was talking about. It's like a heaviness that sits in your chest. So what you're looking at there is a photo of majarateng. So they use that as an explosive dust. And what's really interesting is when you look at it, those particles are quite big, and so you can't imagine breathing them in. So I'm not suggesting that she's lying, but rather I argue that this image is the closest representation for her to articulate what it is that they're breathing in. Often dust is invisible, and when it's fractured, it becomes smaller. So to me, it is a metaphorical comparison. Yes, and so, and the damage, so the invisibility of this dust is linked to a term called slow violence, which I will go back to. But when you look at this handful of dust, you don't necessarily think of it as violence or that it could pose violence on a body. But I will get back to that a little bit later. So the title of the paper comes from one of my research informants, and his name is Sipho. And so he started working at Dree Gold Mine in 1997 and left the mine in 2003. After 6 years of service, on his own accord, he left. He complained that the air was dusty underground and he was breathing in dust even though he was wearing a mask underground. He was still breathing in with a mask, and he repeatedly said that the air was contaminated and that he felt like he was suffocating. So this is where the title comes from. He further went on to say that he couldn't breathe due to the smell of dynamite. And so because of this, he quit his job. At the time of the research, Sipho was working at a construction company. He was a lot happier and claimed to have no trouble breathing because he was no longer exposed to mine dust. Sipho was diagnosed with TB towards the end of 2007. This is 4 years after leaving his job in the gold mine. But when I asked him and probed him, he said with certainty that it was the TB and that it had stayed in his body from the mines. He was now working for a construction company where he was also exposed to dust. And so when I asked him, could it not possibly be the dust from the construction company? He was like, no, it's not the dust from the construction company, it's the dust from the mines. So TB could be attributed to a precise geographical location, which is underground. So this is also a narrative from Kasime. Kasime has also worked, she also works underground as a rock driller at Impala Platinum. And she had to say, I think it's safe to say I got TB underground from the dust. Oh, that dust is so powerful. It's funny, we're only taught about fall of ground and how they're so dangerous, but no one warns you about the dust and the damage that it does to your body. For any of you guys who don't know, fall of ground is literally when you're underground and the ground just collapses. So I spoke about slow violence, and I want to speak about how the damage that breathing in dust does over time and how miners make sense of this. So this is again Amo, and that's actually a photo of her underground. And this day we were speaking and she was telling me about how she went to a private physician, and the private physician is the one who diagnosed her with TB. And what was particularly interesting is that when he looked at her x-ray, he was like, but what job do you do? And so there's this idea of wasting away gradually because of, or dying inside because of the dust that you're breathing in as a result of working underground and exploitative labor. So Amo's, no, let me just go back. So Amo's statement highlights the nuanced embedded meanings that miners attach to dust and the power this ideology has in shaping the miners' perceptions of TB. Amo suggests that it's environmental hazards such as dust that are not recognized as a violence at all against humans. Miners, on the other hand, perceive dust as inflicting a slow violence on their bodies. Also illustrated by Sipho, who said that he was suffocating, So this invisible violence affects the health of miners in the long run. And a couple of years later, I tried to track down Sipho, and a friend of his told me that he had returned to the Eastern Cape and he had a growth that was detected in his lungs. And he believes that it was because of working on the mines. So just quickly, when I speak about, so I think of dust as a metaphor, and it's a critique of their working conditions, capitalist experiences. But I decided to use slow violence as a as the theory that holds everything together. Now, and it's by Rob Nixon, the concept. And Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence is a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight across time. It's not viewed as a violence. So the notion of breathing, we don't think of breathing underground as violence, but it is a violence, and it's damaging people's bodies. And it's damaging people's bodies. So it was environmental theory, but I think that it can be extrapolated and be used to make sense of what is going on inside of miners' bodies. And then just one last thing, Amo spoke about how she feels like she's dying inside gradually, slowly, because of breathing in dust. I'm actually done. Let me just video. Yes, done.
Thank you so much, Mutsawashe. Thank you. That was lovely. And I recall your research, I think, was in some beginning phases when I last heard you speak. So it's lovely to see kind of this research that came together in 2017.
Okay,
thank you so much. Yeah, it was great to see your
screen now.
There we go. I hope you didn't mind my very rudimentary indication of time, but you managed to finish. Super, thank you so much for that presentation. So for those of you who don't know, we'll be moving on to the next speakers. Each of them is 20 minutes, and then we'll come back to everybody and have rounds of questions thereafter. So for now, we have Salima Valiani, and she'll be our next presenter. She's a familiar face in South African academic sort of circles, and her presentation is Oxygen and Suffocation in South Africa's Healthcare System. And Salima is currently an independent researcher, and she's the author of the research monograph Rethinking Unequal Exchange, the Global Integration of Nursing Labour Markets. And she's published around union work and on governmental organizations in Canada and South Africa. So Salima, I will let you begin your presentation. Thank you very much. Okay. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you to the organizers. It's a great transdisciplinary event to be part of. And thanks also to Mutsawashe. I think there's some real parallels we can draw. I'll try to point them out. So my presentation is based on 2 papers, which I very much encourage people to read for all the detail, that I can't get to today. Oxygen and Suffocation in South Africa's Health System. I want to start by giving you a few examples over the decades since 1994 of nurses' experiences in South Africa. Nurses, of course, make up 81% of the health labor force in this country. So it's the vast majority of health workers that are nurses, and 89% of those are women. So there is I think, a feminist interest in this question of nurses' experiences. In one of the papers that I've posted, I argued, this was long before COVID and even before breath, that nurses are the oxygen of the South African health system. And so in going through some of these experiences, I want to ask about the quality of that breathing of nurses. And I think gasping is an excellent description. Also slow violence, as we've just heard about. So people will know that in the early and mid-90s, there were public sector strikes and nurses joined those strikes. Some years later, 20 nurses were interviewed about the reasons why they struck. And we know, given misogyny, that when nurses strike, it's seen in a particularly negative light as compared to other workers. And so these nurses joined, and they said that the reasons were poor pay, inability to access leave, lack of recognition of their work, poor workplace relations, especially with management. Now we go to about 10 years later, a survey taken in 2005 around stressors and job satisfaction of nurses. There were almost 1,500 respondents, and these were all primary healthcare nurses in the Free State. And we hear many of the same stressors. About 30% of these respondents talked about workload as a stressor. 16% talked about limited resources, and 15% talked about lack of recognition and lack of communication with management. Going another 5 years on, as nurses started to emigrate, leave the country, a study was done around retention and major factors in nurse emigration. Shortages and excessive overtime came out as a major reason. Lack of professional development opportunities, lack of rewards for the work, and difficult work relations. So overtime is linked to shortages of workers, I argue. And we have only one estimate from government that I'm aware of around the numbers of professional nurses. And we know that nurses are divided into about 4 different categories. So professional nurses are the highest skilled workers in this category. So the Department of Health estimated a shortage of 44,780 nurses in 2011. And this I got from one of the studies. You look at my paper, and it was not ultimately published by the Department of Health from the same document that was quoted by an academic. So there's not a lot of talk about the number of nurses in shortage, but this is an estimate, and this is likely on the low side, which I will get into later. Let's go now to 2015. There was a study of 69 nurses, mostly public sector, but also some private sector nurses in 5 Free State and Gauteng hospitals. Over 90% of these nurses cited workplace constraints that were preventing them from upholding the Code of Ethics and the South African Nurses Pledge. So we look at nurses, we criticize nurses a great deal in this country, and we often talk about whether they have ethics, whether we question their moral standing. And so the workplace constraint that was most cited was disrespect from patients, along with blame by management for errors and other problems stemming from systemic inefficiencies and staff shortages. Now, we've heard a lot from these nurses about difficulties with management. But when you look at the studies of nurse managers, you get this kind of experience. And I'm going to read directly from one of the respondents in a study done in Gauteng. And this was in the primary healthcare sector. I had informed the clinic supervisor a month prior to arrange someone for relief, and she had promised to do so. 2 weeks before and a week prior, I again reminded her, and she still did not know who she was going to send to my clinic to relieve the sister on leave. They sent me someone else whom I was only made aware of that morning. Another professional nurse from the clinic where the relief sister works called, demanding that she returns back to her clinic. Meanwhile, there are 4 professional nurses in the same clinic, harassing her that she should return to the clinic. When I checked on her, she was tearful and threatening to resign. She found herself torn between wanting to assist at my clinic and being recalled back to her clinic. This frustrated me even more. The pain. I realized I was emotionally drained. I called my supervisor, who at the time was actually changing from what she said. She now wanted the relief sister to go back to her original clinic whilst she searched for another one. I refused that the professional nurse leaves the clinic before the relief arrived. After 2 hours, no one arrived. I called again. The nurse was restless and having her bag in hand and was on her way out. This really frustrated me. I think that speaks to gasping. Now, interestingly, I found there was a time and motion study done of hospital nurses. And these were nurse managers in medical, surgical, pediatric, and maternity wards of 9 public and private hospitals in Gauteng and Free State. This study found that on average, nurse managers in these hospital wards performed 36 different tasks per hour. These tasks were mainly fragmented, unplanned, and of very short duration. Again, we see staff shortages.
Salima, you've muted yourself by mistake.
Sorry, I'm back. And now I'm going to share my screen. And I want to look at some, oh dear. Okay, yes. I want to go to the other end of the hierarchy, student nurses. So this was a study of student nurses and on violence experienced. Have a look at the types of violent behavior and the percentage of respondents. This is a fairly recent study. Being treated differently due to undergraduate status, that's the highest, 30.5 respondents. The lowest, almost 20% of respondents reporting that they have experienced being shouted at in a rage. Who are the most typical perpetrators of this workplace violence? Again, we see the predictable hierarchy. Professional nurses who are at the top, along with sisters in charge. So those would be the nurse managers, staff nurses, other nursing students, also quite high, and then also nursing assistants. I want to give one final example of violence, and that would be a COVID example. In about May, we were hearing that in the Eastern Cape, nurses were being prevented from having access to the personal protective gear by hospital and clinic managers who were withholding it. And in some of these hospitals, doctors were actually hoarding the equipment, though they were refusing to go and examine the patients. So nurses were going in to examine patients, but they didn't have access to the gear they needed to protect themselves. What greater expression of disrespect. So I want to go into the context for these types of experiences and some of the systemic causes. So here we have the Indigo Wellness Index. This was done in 2018, and we have the result of South Africa scoring the lowest score in the world. So it means by this index, South Africa is the most unhealthy country in the world. And you can see the contrast with Canada there. So the higher the number, the worst off. Sorry, the lower the number, the worst off. And South Africa is hovering around 0 for many of these indicators. And you see the range from tobacco, depression, diabetes, blood pressure. So nurses are carrying this burden, which of course is a historical burden. Maybe I should stop sharing so you can have a change. Okay.
So Nima, just to let you know, you've got 6 minutes left.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
So Kuvadia and co-authors talk about the historical causes of this very high mortality and morbidity in South Africa. And they identify a range of diseases linked to poverty, so malnutrition, maternal death, infectious diseases, as well as non-communicable diseases, which are more typical of richer countries, plus one social problem that is violence. All of these they root in the history of colonization and war in this country. So what we have then is great need in South Africa for healthcare. And we see nurses are basically shouldering that weight. So we would think that there would be lots of nurses in this country, right? Given that they are the highest bulk of healthcare workers. But when we look for this 20-year period, 98 to 2018, we see very little rise in the nurse to population ratio in South Africa. So basically we've gone up from 41 nurses per 10,000 people to 49. This is very low given the need that I've just touched on briefly, and it's low relative to other middle income countries, which you can look at in the paper, all of which have higher life expectancy, so not as much trouble to deal with in the healthcare setting. I bring all of this back to the lack of government health expenditure on public health care. And what we see in this graph is that between 2000 and 2016, South Africa, again, a middle income country, relatively well off in the continent, consistently well below the 15% of government spending going towards health that was committed to by the African Union way back in 2001, when the HIV pandemic was being felt strongly. So South Africa has had extremely low health expenditure, and nurses have shouldered that weight. And this, of course, goes along with increasing inequality in those same years. Interestingly, there's very little analysis around this graph here in the health systems literature. And it was quite a task to get this published in the paper. So please do look at that table. I think this tendency to then take nurses for granted and actually blame nurses for a lot of the problems that are far beyond their control is rooted in misogyny, as I was saying earlier. So what is the solution? And that you will find in the other paper, Structuring Sustainable Universal Healthcare. I can't go into a lot of that, but I want to highlight one. I point to 3 keys to structuring a sustainable universal healthcare system in this country. Decommodified universal healthcare, tackling the roots of the ill health, and a focus on female health workers, and that would be nurses as well as community health workers who haven't been able to talk about today, but these nurses need to be enabled, and these female health workers need to be enabled to lead because they are already leading, but without recognition and without support. What is decommodified universal healthcare? I recently published something that elaborates on this related to COVID. And what I said there is ecologically sound public production of health goods, from food to psychological support, medicines to medical technology, as well as medical care. And this public production needs to be designed and managed by citizens, the range of healthcare workers, as well as the other workers involved. Now, we have the National Health Insurance here in South Africa, and one thing that is a major flaw in this proposal, which nobody is talking about, is the purchaser-provider split. Basically, what the plan is here in South Africa is to take up what has been done for the past 20 years in much of Europe and failed, which is accessing services, healthcare services from private providers rather than producing the services under the public system. What this has shown to arrive at in public healthcare systems in the UK, in Sweden, in Finland, there are extensive examples, is escalating costs, decreasing access to care, as well as monopolies of the people providing the supplier, the healthcare services. All of that is what we already have in South Africa. You will recognize, right, those characteristics. One last point before my time goes. The health market inquiry done here in South Africa showed the extent of monopoly throughout all of those healthcare goods that I just mentioned here in South Africa. This was reported in the provisional report, read my paper to find direct quotes, and underplayed in the final report of the health market inquiry. But it found that 4 companies dominate the entire healthcare goods chain, and those would be ultimately the companies that we rely on to provide public health care. So we can just imagine what that is going to mean for cost. Here are the 4 companies: Remgro, Afrocentric Investment Corporation, as well as Life Healthcare and Netcare. The last 2 were not even studied in the HMI because of the power of these corporations to get themselves out of the study. So they were able to argue in court that they should not be considered in the study. You can read there the range of holdings of both of the other 2 companies. It's everything from hospitals, pharmacies, medical product production. There you go. So what we need here is a political solution. We talk a lot about expropriation without compensation when it comes to land. We need to start thinking about how to decommodify public health care and whether this is a call around which we can mobilize. Please ask me questions and I can elaborate on everything I've not managed to touch on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Salima. That was fascinating. And so it certainly speaks to my work personally, but I think you've given us a lovely kind of contextualization of the South African healthcare system and how pivotal nurses are in that system and sort of gasping for air in what they have to manage day to day. Yeah, I have many questions on your papers, and I'm definitely going to read your papers actually. So thank you so much. That was great. So Zita Guduna, you are up next. If I can just introduce you. So Zita is a professor, curator, and author of Beckett's Breath, Antithiericality, excuse me, and the Visual Arts. And she's currently head of operations at Raymond Pettibon Studio and a visiting professor at CUNY, or City University of New York, as well as New York University. And she's a researcher at the Organism for Poetic Research. So Zita, I will let you go ahead with your presentation, and I believe Charlotte will assist us with some videos. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for this incredible initiative. I have been working on breath since 1999, and I hope that I can help illuminate some of the concerns that my colleagues discussed about through the art perspective, how art can help us have be eco-conscious and politically conscious on the subject of respiration. We can start with the first video, the nose peg. Perhaps it is also relevant for the American elections as well. Is there sound?
My apologies.
Introducing the Personal Embarrassment Guard, or PEG, a new wearable that holds your nose so you don't have to.
We've taken a classic design and completely reimagined it. We learned that more people than ever are willing to do business with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. But how do you ignore those awkward war crimes? The solution was right under our nose.
Developed especially for diplomats, PEG's nasal technology blocks the smell of war crimes, leaving you free to negotiate. Simply pair it with your phone and swipe to neutralize the stench of hospital bombings, the reek of mass torture, and those awkward releases of gas.
No one needs a moral compass getting in the way of a good deal. And don't just silence your conscience. Peg it.
The atmosphere is but one manifestation of the external structuring conditions of our existence, while breathing is an internal structuring condition. Even small changes in earth temperatures dramatically affect oxygen levels, behavior, reproductive patterns, activity, and movement. These often unconscious, unnoticed, and invisible human and non-human biological processes are the barometer of social and political expression of freedom. The inability to breathe and social breathlessness, as well as notions like settler atmospherics and socio-atmospherics of power, as described by Simmons, are considered in the context of in the context of post-COVID-19 contemporary art practice. The socio-atmospherics of power affects our bodies, but also non-human and more than human creatures, while climate justice is drastically extended to a multi-species justice. Through the presentation of art practices, strategies, and artworks on the theme of respiration, the presentation examines the ways the recognition of the current shared vulnerability that we're experiencing and the aesthetic collaborations with the atmosphere can respond to environmental mourning and provide social opportunities. Humans deoxygenate ourselves and other species. Nevertheless, the metaphor of respiration can hold the potential for expanding climate and social change discourse in politically and ethically creative ways. The video that we just seen, which was a very satirical and humorous video, is used as a creative way of explaining the complicated diplomatic situation in Syria. The fictional wearable peg for politicians blocks out the stench of war crimes. According to Kristen Simmons, the conditions we breathe in are collective and unequally distributed, with particular qualities and intensities that are felt differently through and across time. For indigenous nations, the implications of US militarism, industrialism, and capitalism have always been palpably felt on indigenous lands and through indigenous bodies from extraction to experimentation. The regimes of these foundational violences are the surrounds of settler atmospherics. Atmosphere becomes a medium for repression, as in George Floyd's last words, "I can't breathe," that echoed those of Eric Garner, murdered in the US by the police in 2014. Floyd was forced on the ground and killed by a knee on his neck. The knee pressed down for almost 9 minutes. Garner repeated the word breathe 11 times. Garner's words became all the more powerful as they emerged and became part of the Black Lives Matter movement, as we've seen this summer. The presentation aspires to envelop a political understanding of breath and to consider how attending to the matter of respiration might help art theory and practice to rethink themselves and to make the shift from the unconscious biological respiration to the metaphor of combat breathing. As Frantz Fanon argues in his book A Dying Colonialism, there is not occupation of territory on the one hand and independence of persons on the other. It is the country as a whole, its history, its daily pulsation that are contested, disfigured in the hope of a final destruction. Under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It's a combat breathing, a conscious breathing. For example, Oscar Munoz's piece on respiration that you can find on the file I have uploaded on your site represents the politically disappeared in South and Central America. The victims' images appeared for the duration of audiences' exhalations. Munoz's surfaces are diluting. They seem like daguerreotypes, an old technique for art, while images become clear only when viewers breathe on them. With a breath, sepia photographs of desaparecidos, young Colombian men proclaimed disappeared by their government, appear on the surface. As Amanda Graham noted, here the aesthetic disappearance parallels the corporeal political one. Can we see the Navridis piece, please? Hello?
Just a sec.
Can we share the Navridis? Without sound. Navridis is an artist that has been working on breath for many years. He's an architect and an artist, and he has found ways of us experiencing our breath in a material way. He brings in, he tries to materialize this immaterial formation.
I'm so sorry about that. It just disappeared for a second.
I can continue talking, and when you, by investigating the politics of respiration within contemporary society, and also in the context that we're experiencing now, and the gasping, as this section is entitled, we take as a starting point the shortness of breath, which is also minimalism in art, derived from the experience of global political pressure and economic austerity as well, exploring its connection with performance art and embodied politics. Air, the most necessary and common of all living resources, becomes a material signifier for the invisible political bonds that constitute a society. As Sloterdijk emphasizes, humans simply cannot not breathe. Sloterdijk died recently. He's a theoretician that has focused on the philosophy of air and breath. The historical and contemporary art pieces aim to engage with the perceptual and political imaginary of the beholders and to provide the potential of public engagement with breath, like the piece that we're watching now, that is an interactive piece. A public engagement with breath by encouraging multiple perspectives on health, art, and life, and by establishing original methods of understanding the role that respiration plays in our sensory, emotional, and spiritual life. Breath, as a medium, is commonly understood as the physical basis of the organism and of the body's manifold sensory apparatus. This bioprocess meditates and is mediated, and a fundamental reading of the respiratory system emphasizes its formative value as the communicative agent between the individual, the outside world, and time. The act of mediation is a process, and in this sense, the medium of breath always internalizes a singular engagement with temporality. As we see here, the balloon is a record of our temporality, of this record of breaths in the installation piece that we're watching now, and thus defines the ways in which we collectively and individually perceive and understand our environment. The philosophical and aesthetic questions dealt with are wide-ranging, but gain their specificity from the focus on the politics of respiration. In turn, the ramifications of this analysis are worked out in the specificity of respiration, but are far-reaching in relation to an interdisciplinary sensibility, since we are gathered here from the medical sciences and from the arts and humanities. Can we turn to the Kanarinka video, please? Can we watch the next one?
Sorry, which one would you like me to play for you?
The Kanarinka video.
It takes 154,000 breaths to evacuate Boston.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. This is after the terrorist attacks in Boston. So it's not I can't breathe. My claim is that it's not a recent phenomenon. Metaphors of breathing have been used in the past. We can have this with sound, please. We understand the difficulties in giving form to this formless material like breath. In 2007, the multimedia artist Kanarinka ran the Boston evacuation route system to try to measure our fear in post 9/11 public spaces. The artist ran through the evacuation routes that were created in American cities after September 11 so that the civilians could escape the city in case of a terrorist attack. During her runs, she was wearing complex technological equipment that counted, recorded, and augmented her breaths through speakers. The project was an attempt to measure our post-9/11 collective fear in the individual breaths that it takes to traverse these new geographies of insecurity. Where we watched the audio archive sculptural piece that she created from this series of runs. There are 26 jars corresponding to 26 runs. Each jar size corresponds to the number of breaths from that run. Can we see the Abramovich video, please? The Marina Abramovich and Ulai. It's an interactive and dual video, an older piece by Marina Abramovich and Ulai.
With sound?
Yes, yes. These are the relational pieces that Abramovich and Ulai worked during the 70s, and it's an expiration and inhalation, and the two artists are actually, this is a metaphor of their relationship. Detached from established aesthetic norms, the selected corporeal pieces by female artists such as Lygia Clark, you can, by looking at the files that we have uploaded, you can see, we don't have enough time to watch all these different works, but I'm talking about pieces that I have included in the document. By artists like Lygia Clark, the Brazilian, Breathe With Me, Valley Export, Breath Text, Love Poem, Anna Mendieta's Untitled Grass Breathing, Marina Abramovich with Ulai that we just watched, the Feminist Art Workers, This Ain't No Heavy Breathing, Nancy Sparrow, Woman Breathing, Anne Hamilton, Flower Breath, Body Object Series, and Sophie Dupont, Marking Breath. They investigate the materiality of respiration by also offering an alternative to the modernist ideas of medium specificity, since they were experimenting also with a medium. So breathing and respiration help them to experiment with notions that they wouldn't have normally experimented with. Can we put the Saraceno, the poetic breath piece, please? It can be with sound. On the 15th of January, 2020, Aerosine Passa, a fuel-free hot air balloon lifted the person into the sky, landing safely back on Earth using only sun and air we all breathe, setting 6 unprecedented world records. For the first time in human history, humans fly free into the air. Passa flies without fossil fuels, batteries, lithium, solar panels, helium, hydrogen, and carbon emissions. This marks the most sustainable human flight in the history of aviation, being certified by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. Flying with the Aerosine Passat proves that humans, in ethical alliance with all who we share this planet with and elemental energies, can break the toxic bond with fossil fuels and the extractive ideologies underpinning the Capitalocene. Aerosine Passat achieved something wholly unprecedented, setting a total of 6 records under the category of the general female categories for altitude, distance, and duration of the human solar flight, and were undertaken with the Fédération Aéronautique, approved observers, and 2 Argentine validated pilots in order to comply with this renowned institution's stringent norms. Yeah, we can stop that. Was I, while I was talking, you could listen to me?
You just have a minute left. I was just trying to indicate your time. We could definitely hear you.
Yeah. So we will finish with breath, with Beckett's breath, the video, the Damenhurst video. The life-giving immaterial force of respiration coexists in breath, in Beckett's breath, with a perplexing terror caused by the decay of humanity, as it is signified by the presence of waste, medical waste in this case, in the video of Damenhurst, a British artist that is very concerned with medical waste. Waste affects the aerial environment and by extension our bodies, but also non-human or more than human creatures. Beckett's decision to eradicate the actor in his play Breath is not only a formal decision, nor is it only an allegorical statement about the human condition. It is a critical response to a post-Holocaust reality that is depicted on stage as a stagnant landscape filled with waste. The understanding of the materiality of breath attending to the matter of respiration helps performance to rethink itself and with an enhanced appreciation of the aerosine. The atmosphere has become a highly stressed zone, and air, the most necessary and common of all living resources, becomes a material signifier for the invisible political bonds that constitute the society. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thanks, Rosita. What a presentation that brought together such a lot of interesting work, sort of quite unsettling but humorous as well. Yeah, it was really fascinating. Thank you very much. And thank you to Charlotte for doing the AV behind the scenes
for all her help throughout the preparation.
Super. Yeah, so thanks to our 3 presenters. It's now time for questions. Sorry, we have run a bit over time, starting a little bit late and sorting out all the videos. So I think let's take rounds of 3, just because we've got quite varied content, and yeah, just to give everyone a chance to kind of ask questions as well as a chance for all the speakers to respond. So please, please feel free to use the chat box if you'd prefer to put your questions there, and I'll look out for those. And then, of course, if you can just, if you want to, how should we raise your hands or unmute yourself, and then, yeah, go ahead. I don't see any, let me change to gallery view so I can see all of you. Yeah, let me know if I see hands, and I'll look out for unmuting as well, if anyone wants to go ahead. Carla, sorry, go ahead.
No, I know Wazi also has a question for Mutsa. Did people have particular ideas of how to cleanse themselves of the contamination of the dust? So I'm going to throw that to Mutsa, and then I have a question for all three of the panelists, and thank you very much. That's been one of the most interesting collaborations or kind of, you know, interesting crossovers of discussions that we've had to date. So thank you very much to all of you. Really appreciate that. I'm very interested in the ideas, Salima, that kind of comes up in your work and speaks closely to Mutsa's, but also Zita, to yours around the notions of hierarchy. So Zita, you mentioned like more than human, non-human, so that idea of how the kind of initial construction of the time was the Anthropocene as opposed to, you know, perhaps the Capitalocene or the Cthulhucene, and how that idea of hierarchy we still struggle with. And, you know, even today, the kind of sense of a global breath holding for an election in one country, because there is a kind of hierarchy happening there. And Salima, your commentary on the hierarchies embedded in nursing systems, but the way in which that hierarchy is played out in other components of the health system. So on campus here a few years ago, 2 years ago now, there was a direct kind of protest by many students around hierarchy, because students from different disciplines kind of do that thing of, you know, it's always the medical students at the top and then everybody else underneath. And of course, we don't even do nursing on our campus directly through our university. So then nurses sort of feature, and then, you know, community health workers. So how that hierarchy is perpetuated even at exactly the same point, where the care is being given often by those not at the highest end of the hierarchy. And I liked your commentary on this being a feminist kind of process to consider. And I just wondered if you had kind of additional thoughts on how or what would work to destabilize that hierarchy. And I know that's a really large question. And Mutsa, I was also very interested, I mean, you know, the great, I suppose, I want to say irony, but I'm not really sure it is, but that, you know, one of the things that was meant to be this great moment of transformation in the mining industry was that gender would be recognized and women would go underground. And it was a bit like, and it's one of those kind of moments where, yes, okay, everybody who wants to go underground should be able to go underground. And yet we know that the experiences of women underground is deeply mediated by gender, and, you know, how women are able or not able to experience or access certain types of roles. And I just wondered, you know, I know your new work is looking also at reproduction, but in your discussion with the women miners in these different spaces, what other aspects of their kind of experience were gendered in this context? Thank you very much.
Super, thanks, Carla. I think given that you've got questions for all of the panelists, let's give you all a chance to answer Carla, and then we'll go to the next round of questions from people. So Zita, you look the most confident, and yes, okay, go ahead, please.
Not that there are answers, but it's a paradox that breathing and air that should be a shared common is not, because we all have the capacity to breathe, but obviously the I can't breathe came for people who are underprivileged. It's not that there is a hierarchy, of course, and we haven't heard the manifestation of I can't breathe from people that are not that are privileged or in higher hierarchies. And of course, there is also an issue with the non-humans, because they don't have a voice to express the fact that we have restricted their capacity to breathe. So animals and all other non-human lives that cannot actually, we have affected their respiration, their capacity to breathe. And I try to focus on female artists, because it's not, I believe that it's not by chance that it's mostly female artists that have managed to try to find their voice through breathing, because they didn't have a voice. some of them, especially artists that were experimenting with performance. It was usually artists that couldn't enter the canon of painting, and they found a way through performance to have a voice in the art market and the art system. That's it for me.
Thanks, Suzita. Salima, did that an indication you're okay to go next? Yes, okay, thank you. You're muted.
I'm so worried about my creaking chair that I mute all the time. I will take up this question of hierarchy. I mean, I think you saw it in the paper with regard to nurses. So even the nurse managers, of course, are not very high up in the hierarchy. And so the clinic managers, the hospital managers, they have the greater power. But where does the tension develop? It develops amongst the nurses, largely. But let me take it up on a systemic basis as well, and go to one of the graphs I had to miss. So we saw that Canada is the other end of the Indigo Wellness Index, right? It's one of the most well countries in the world. But when you look at the public healthcare system, you get some very similar hierarchies and difficulties that we see in the South African health system. So I was saying that the public, the split between providing the service and producing them and paying for them, that has not taken shape in Canada as it has in much of Europe. So in Canada, with regard to hospital care, it is still fully publicly provided. But what is happening inside the hospitals? Okay, so we look at the whole of the healthcare system in Canada over time with regard to expenditure, which means costs, right? And we have a hierarchy of costs. That hierarchy is dominated by physicians, prescribed and non-prescribed drugs, and capital. So all the machines that we use in healthcare. Those are the three lines at the bottom. The expenditure on hospitals over time, and this is a period when we've had the fully public healthcare in Canada, the trends continue past 2000, which I'll get to. But what have we seen? We've seen that the spending has gone down by 11% on hospitals, which is the public provision, right? Meanwhile, the spending on physicians, on drugs, and on medical technology has either gone up or been steady. And between 2000 and 2008, what has happened is that hospital spending is steady while the other ones have doubled. So what this means is that nurses, who are the ones running the hospitals, right, and the other predominantly female healthcare workers, they are paid by salaries by the hospitals. The spending there, as you saw, has gone down and it has plateaued because it can't go down any further. Meanwhile, we have illness and old age increasing. So the workload has gone up, but the spending has remained at that minimum that we hit in the year 2000. That's 20 years ago. So how do we get rid of this hierarchy? This is why I'm proposing decommodified public health care. And the way to decommodify healthcare is to have a plan around how to slowly make the production fully public. And during COVID, we've heard a lot about Cuba and its ability to take on this pandemic. Cuba has also been providing a lot of medication for COVID patients around the world. China was the first to take up some of the medication produced there, and it's publicly produced. So some 65% of the drugs used in Cuba in the healthcare system are produced by the public. So that is the kind of situation we need to work toward in all countries. And so this goes beyond what the WHO has taken up, the universal health coverage goal, right? This goes far beyond that, because universal health coverage is just about introducing this split between who pays for it and who provides it. So you have the public paying the private, which is making profits, and the money can never add up. I say I bring in expropriation without compensation, because the way that Cuba has managed to do this is that following the revolution, they nationalized all of the pharmaceutical and medical technology production happening in the country and moved from there. Again, that undoes the hierarchy, whereby goods that are basic and needed by the majority are a means of profit for the minority. The only way to begin to undo that is to have a strong public move to decommodify. And in South Africa, a survey was done whereby 62% of the people did believe that progressive financing of the health system is a good thing. So along with that, you need a progressive tax structure, right? Because that is the way that all the money that is being spent on private healthcare in this country can go toward the public system, and everybody is served by the same system, which contains all of those goods that we need. I better stop
Salima,
there.
if I can ask you, sorry, we've got to still get to Mutsawashe and the rest of the questions as well. So perhaps we can come back. I mean, I got the sense that you managed to answer that question. Thanks for the info about Cuba, actually. Thank you. Mutsa?
Thank you so much, Nawazi, for your question. So yes, milk. Miners often talk about like before they go to work drinking milk, and after they come back drinking milk, and to sort of ooze the heaviness of breathing in dust. And very recently here in Zimbabwe, a white carrot, and I found that really interesting. For Carla, I'm going to give you 3 examples. And 3 examples. So I think the first would be seeking authority underground and acceptance from male workers underground. I have a story of this lady who worked underground, and she's a rock driller, which is very rare. And she spoke about how men would not listen to her underground. And she narrated the story about how like she was like, you're not leaving work until your shift is done. You're not going to surface until your work is done. So getting that authority. And then there's the usual stuff such as your overalls and your work equipment. And so when you go underground, you're wearing an overall, and you're also wearing almost like a oxygen kit, and it's heavy. And so if you're going to the bathroom as a female, you have to take that off. That's quite problematic. And then also around experiences of being sick with TB. So a lot of the women I dealt with were were single-headed households. And I remember Mo Rachel, she was sick with TB and she needed to be admitted into hospital for a month. And the question is what to do with the kids. Who's going to take care of the kids when she's in isolation taking her TB treatment? So those are just some of the stuff.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, Carla, for those very diverse questions. I don't see any hands up or any other questions in the box. Does anyone want to unmute and go ahead? Otherwise, I have a few questions.
Yes, my hand is up.
Yes. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, can I also do that 3 questions thing?
Oh, sorry.
Just want to say, Mutsawashe, I love your presentation. I just have one question. I wondered if you explored the link between TB and HIV within the mining sector, particularly in relation to gender power relations with particularly underground, with those who work underground. Then I have a question for Salima. Salima, most nurses live in townships or low middle class areas. They use public transport. They face all the economic and social ills of these communities from which they come, including the poor service delivery, violence against women, high transport costs, poor environmental conditions, etc., etc., etc. And then, of course, they have to deal with treating these people as patients as well. I mean, I have a few nurses in my family, and I know the feeling of gasping for breath because very often they suffer on that. So when we talk about the morbidity and mortality, can we look at issues of intersectionality of race and gender and the so-called historical class and how this impacts? And then just another one in terms of the backlog of nurse or the shortage of nurses. I mean, given that the education system in terms of nursing education has changed, where we moved from the whole internship and you then could then become a nurse, and now nurses have to pay for their own studies, they have to go to university, because before you had nursing colleges. Are we ever going to make up that shortfall? Do you have any ideas? And then just finally, so Zita, I really loved your presentation. And I love the idea of breath as a manifestation of the soul or spirit, which is exactly what the Khoisan see it as spirit, breath is spirit. And for us, therefore, the linkage between the physical and the metaphysical, breathing is very important because of Earth's spirit, its breath, and its connection with the universe. And of course, it's been depicted in rock art. So I was just wondering how historical understandings in art of breath link in with current manifestations, particularly around the ecological movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. So we've got a minute to go. If the speakers could answer fairly briefly, and then perhaps we could agree to say spend another 10 minutes. Those who obviously need to log off and go, but would the presenters be happy to stay around for another 10 minutes to answer questions? Great. But so if I can add on to Vanessa's question about HIV, in my mind, was how gender actually figured into this idea of susceptibility to TB and susceptibility to dust. And I'm just thinking about some notions of female bodies being sort of reservoirs for disease, or maybe being weaker than men or something. So I just wanted to jump onto Vanessa's question and ask, with regards to dust and TB, if there was some sort of gendered perceptions of that being a gendered thing at all, or not.
Right, thank you so much for the questions. So I'm going to start with your question first. So no, there wasn't any gendered aspects of TB per se. There's a common agreement amongst many miners that maybe certain jobs make you more susceptible to TB, but that's primarily based on how much dust is in that location and what job you're doing. And then to Vanessa, no, it isn't something that I have explored. I try to stay away from HIV because of their, not to romanticize, you know, with HIV and TB. But what I can say is that knowing the women tend to be more pedantic about knowing their statuses, in comparison to men. And then also from speaking to research informants, they've often spoken about TB2, which alludes to the co-infection of HIV and TB. So often they'll be snickering behind someone's back that this person has TB too. But I'm not too sure how that plays underground and how that affects work relations underground. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. Salima?
Okay. I think to Vanessa, it would be great to do a study of nurses' health in South Africa for all of the reasons that you mentioned, in addition to the occupational aspects which would feed into health. And I did such a paper for nurses in Canada, which was possible because there happens to be one survey that was done with nurses relating to health. And what that survey found, I mean, if you interpret it, it was a survey, but it wasn't really analyzed. So when I analyzed it, what I found is that in comparison to all other female workers in Canada, nurses had the poorest health. And in South Africa, I would imagine you would have something quite similar. But of course, we don't have such a survey in this country. And such a survey would have to be done by government. Can we make up for the shortfall in nurses? So on the one hand, there's the shortage that we can surmise from government numbers that I gave. But what about the overall shortage that I showed with regard to need of the population and the nurse to population ratio? Well, if we don't solve the spending problem, then we will not be able to have enough nurses or enough community health workers, which of course is the area where there has been the greatest labor force growth in the past 5-10 years in South Africa. It's not in nurses, it's in community health workers. And we know why, right? We know why. It's because we don't pay them. We pay them very little. For 2 years going now in the national budget, there was a commitment that community health workers would earn the minimum wage. It still has not been met. So community health workers who are performing a great deal of healthcare are being paid through honorariums. And there was a very good testimonial book done by Kenya College, 16 in-depth stories of community health workers. Those women talked about going for years without receiving an honorarium. Why? Because of the supply chain corruption, these workers are not being paid. So the health spending issue, let me just touch on that briefly. South Africa has the highest proportion of healthcare spending done through health insurance, right? Private health insurance in the world. It comes in similar to the US at under 50% in terms of government spending on healthcare. So what is happening there? It means that the 16% of the population that is covered through private health insurance is putting all of its money there, and that is the bulk of the healthcare spending. That means less than 20% of the population is getting all this healthcare that the monopolies are producing. Why do I mention the 62% of the people that agree with a progressive health financing system? Because without getting those 16% to spend, to put that money into the public purse, you will not be able to expand public healthcare spending, which means you won't be able to finance the training of nurses, remuneration of community health workers at a living wage, and so on. So all of it has to be dealt with together. We can't only solve the nurse shortage. We have to solve the financing situation. And in the health market inquiry, the provisional findings say that while that 16% is paying higher and higher premiums on the private health insurance, it's getting less and less for the money paid. We know this. We know that our doctors' fees are no longer covered by our health insurance, private health insurance, after June. Why? Because rather than providing us with coverage, the companies, those four big companies, are making money. So that is the means to undoing some of this severe inequality in healthcare, because we need to go as the middle class, progressives, to our friends buying this private health insurance to say, look, there can be a better way. We spend a lot of our own money out of our pockets on healthcare, but we're getting less and less healthcare for it. If we think bigger, we put that money toward the public system, we can all benefit. So
thanks, Halima. Sorry if I can stop you there. We only got a few minutes for Suzita. Although I suspect a lot of health economists might have arguments with you about whether the system's broken enough if you're throwing more money at it is necessarily
the system has a lot of money in it. That's the whole point. The system has a huge amount of money in it.
Yeah. But cool. Suzita, would you like to answer Lisa's question? Thanks.
Yes, indeed, breath is very related to spirit, and in the Greek word pneuma, which is also the pneumonia, it's the root for pneumonia. It means spirit, and Aristotle, we think that it was Aristotle who has read a book on the pneuma and pneumatics, which is also related to the intellect. So spirit and intellect is the same word as pneuma. And I was trying to approach the reality of breath, but of course we can talk about the concept breath and the notion of breath that can be transcendental in that sense, depending on the beliefs of the beholder or the. But about the issue of how art can help disseminate this knowledge, it's like the question about art and politics, whether art can change our to life and whether art can be an activist medium for change. That's a broader question that we have to create another conference for that, but I believe that art indeed can disseminate knowledge about the environment and about air and breathing, and help with notions of understanding the medical humanities.
Thanks, Zita. Thanks, everyone. Is there anyone with one sort of last question or comment that the speakers can go away and think about? We've sort of reached our 10 minutes. Otherwise, I'd just like to congratulate the speakers. I agree with Carla, I can't remember who it was who said there's been a fantastically diverse panel. Some very interconnected issues. And yeah, all of your projects are fascinating, and I think we could speak another 30 minutes to each of your projects. Yeah, any last questions, last hands? Right. So Jade, are you there? No, I think you just unmuted by mistake. Okay. No, thank you so much to everybody who's attended and kind of contributed today, and Charlotte for organizing, and of course Mutsawashe and Carlo for their central role in this whole process. And thank you to our speakers for coming through to this virtual space. I've certainly enjoyed it. And please take a look at the program again for upcoming, oh, Sarah's clapping, for upcoming panels this week and next. Yeah, great, thank you so much. And look out for publications and read Salima's publications that are out and about already.
Thank you so much.
Super.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you again to our presenters, to Renee for your excellent chairing, to Charlotte for all the back-end work, to the whole kind of team that you don't necessarily get to see there. And just again to please welcome you all to carry on supporting the symposium. This is week 3, one of the most exciting weeks definitely, and we would love to have you with us in the last and final week, which is next week. So our focus this week was on environment. Last week we had singing and dancing. This week we've had breathing and healthcare and environment, and dust and air and gasping. And next week we have kind of ideas of loss of breath, suffocation, and our second keynote by Professor Jay McNaughton from the Institute of Medical Humanities at Durham. Also a new range of really exciting creative works. So some of you here have already had your works launched, so thank you very much for those contributions. Please also have a look at the creative works that are up for this week. We have specially commissioned creative works, photography pieces that deal with, I think, Zita, one of the points you raised, how do you express that which is not seen or invisible and yet ever present? And so we invite you to have a look at those. We also have contributions kind of drawn from experiences of California burning. So at this point where it feels like a lot of the states is burning in ways that's going to, the heat of which is we are all going to feel, we invite you to think through the comparisons and where we need to build the solidarities and where and how we need to be working together to address breath breathing in so many spaces. Also later this week, creative work about young people, mental health and COVID that's been co-created by a group of young people kind of thinking through and representing health, and some work by a Malawian artist who has long been a supporter of medical and health humanities, Nixon Malamula. So thank you very much to everyone. We so appreciate your presence, your energy, your time. Those who are across time zones as well, thank you very much. We know it's not always easy, and for your excellent sharing. Thank you, Renee, and look forward to seeing you in all the other spaces.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.